But stems are much more than just mere columns for reaching light. Photosynthesis needs something else. It needs water to happen. Now, this means that the tree has to overcome a very big challenge. Take water from the ground and bring it upwards to the photosynthetic leaves working against gravity. But the tree does not have muscles, does not have mechanical pumps, so how does it do? How can water be hoisted up several tens of meters from the ground, or hundreds of meters, as in the case of the tallest trees on Earth? Well, it's a combination of factors, but most importantly, the water is sucked up from above. The leaves do not only carry out photosynthesis and exchange CO2 and oxygen, they also exchange water with the air in the form of water vapor. Each leaf in fact contains small openings, small pores that are called stomata. We cannot see them right now, we would need a microscope, but especially the lower side of the leaf contains hundreds or thousands of these stomata, little windows that open up to the free air and are responsible for the gas exchange between the tree and the atmosphere. Through the stomata, CO2 comes in, oxygen comes out, and water also comes out by evaporation, or actually what is called evapotranspiration, after it has been used for photosynthesis. So the leaf carries out its magic, the photosynthesis, it evaporates water, and this creates a demand for water from the neighboring tissues, a negative pressure that sucks up water by means of evaporating it, just as it happens with a vacuum. The trees then require water in a chain reaction from neighboring cell to neighboring cell, down through the stem, until the request for water reaches the root system below my feet in this moment. We cannot see it. And here the water is sucked up from the soil. And the part of the tree where the water goes is not the innermost part. The innermost part of the stem is mostly made of dead cells. And these are the ones responsible for mechanically sustaining the tree and its crown, its leaves. The active part, the living part, is a part right below the bark. A very thin layer of cell called the cambium is growing every year, is continuously reproducing, produces cell on the inside and on the outside of this layer. The outside cells eventually become the bark of the tree. The inside cells are the ones that develop into the vascular system of the tree. The vessels, how they're called, or the veins, the blood veins if you want, that carry leaf up to great heights. You may ask, why do trees have a bark in the first place? Well, here we begin our journey into the resilience of trees, the amazing ways by which they have found means of adapting to the pressure of the environment they live in. Of course, each species of tree has its own characteristic bark. Here in the pine, for example, we can recognize it by these large scales or canyons that we can find in the bark itself. Other trees, such as oak, have this corrugated bark, which is also quite recognizable. Birch has a white, papery, very thin bark. I'm sure you're familiar with it, you can recognize it if you see it. But why is there a bark? Well, not only to keep out intruders, which may come in the form of insects or fungi that try to penetrate the leaf. Some of them, like eating or drinking on the sap that flows in the vessels that I was talking about before. But most of all, one environmental agent that has absolutely to be kept out from the tree is fire. And we think that the bark is an evolutionary response to the presence of fire. And here in this forest, I'm starting to see sign of the passage of fire at the foot of each tree. I see black signs, charred bark at the base of each tree. Some trees might have died because of the fire, such as this one behind me. You can still see the charring at the base of the bark. But usually the bark is very effective at holding fire back. So effective, in fact, that we use bark itself as a thermal insulant material. Cork is one of the main materials that we use to thermally insulate our buildings, and it's nothing else than the bark of a species of oak. So not only forests are alive, they grow, they change, they try to maximize and to optimize their strategies to access light, but they also respond to the environment, trying to develop ways to keep factor of harm out of the way. Forests have a complicated relationship with fire. Fire for them can be a damage agent, something that determines death of the trees, but also a necessary environmental factors. For some plants, fire is a blessing because it helps the forest get rid of competitors, of a dominant layer of canopy, making more light accessible for new plants to grow on the forest floor. And some trees have lived with fire for a very long time, learning how to survive when it comes. Some pines, for example, have cones that open up only when the heat from a flame hits them. This is the only way that these cones have to spread their seeds into the environment. The parent tree dies, but the seeds are freed and they will give origin to new plants. These are called fire-adapted species. We have them also in Italy in the Mediterranean environment. Some species of pine, Mediterranean pines, actually display these kind of fire adaptations. Of course, fire is not always good. Not for the forest, not even for ourselves. Especially when it's lit by man and when its effects is spreading through the landscape are made worse by climate change. With fire, in fact, we must distinguish two very different phases. The first one is ignition, what causes a spark to lit up the fire. It can be a lightning, in case of natural causes. Oftentimes, in Italy, 95% of times, it has to do with human activity, willing or unwilling. But the process that is associated to the greatest danger is not ignition, it's fire spread. If a spark is lit up, but the flame is not able to spread into the vegetation, the fire will not go anywhere. So the main attention that forest managers have to pay when dealing with firefighting and fire prevention is the condition under which any ignited flame can spread through the landscape. And these conditions are deeply connected to the state and structure of vegetation. Fire is a herbivore. It likes to eat plant tissue, but it can spread under very specific conditions, like the ones behind me in this very moment. So if a fire comes from this side, for example, it finds a tangle of vegetation, it has a lot to eat, so it will become intense. And eventually it can also use this vegetation to climb up the crown of the trees, where it can become very fast and very dangerous. In the opposite situation, if we have a forest floor that is quite free from vegetation, it is quite clear, then even if a fire comes from this side, for example, from the road, it won't find a lot of underbrush, a lot of undergrowth. It will not be very fast or very intense, and it will not be able to climb up the trees because there's not any fine or small vegetation that can be burned and consumed, allowing the flame to go up there. So this is why we have a saying: forest fires are extinguished 20 years before they happen. And this is another important goal of forest management, especially in places like this, where drought is becoming much more frequent because of man-made climate change. We have to make the forest unburnable, or make it very difficult to burn, by managing the vegetation, especially the small fraction of the vegetation, the dry leaves, the dry branches on the ground, the small undergrowth, and avoiding the flames to become too intense or to spread up to the crown of the trees. Just as we tend to forget that trees are constantly changing and growing, we also forget something else: that they make a lot of sex. Reproduction is the main goal and the main worry of all living beings. And trees have to overcome a very specific challenge: how to meet their partners and how to disperse their offspring while staying always in the same place. And trees have invented something very specific to do all these: pollen and seeds. Pollen and seeds are one of the many ways in which trees interact and are connected with their environment. Trees do flower, do bloom, just as the flowers we're used to see. This, for example, is the flower of a hazelnut. And hazelnut, as you see, chooses a specific strategy. It's flowering even before putting out its leaves. The first thought of hazelnut, even before the start of spring, is reproducing. In a couple of weeks from now, these flowers will produce a cloud of yellow pollen grains that will be picked up by the wind, which shakes this flower very easily, and they will be spread around randomly in the hope of meeting some female flowers, because these, I have to mention, are the male flowers of the hazelnut. Once the pollen has found his female counterpart, fecundation may occur, and the female flower turns into a fruit. And in the fruit, we can find the seeds. Seeds are an incredible invention. They are actually the container of the embryo, of the young tree that will germinate and give rise to a new adult individual. But they are much more than just a container. They are a spaceship, because with the fruit, the seed can go around and travel, overcoming the limitation of the tree to always stay in the same place. Also, the seed is a safety capsule, keeping the embryo safe from predators like birds, insects, small mammals that like to feed on fruits and trees. And just as there are many different strategies to access light, there are many different strategies on how to disperse your seed into the environment. Pines, for example, uses pine cones. Every pocket of this cone uses to contain 2 seeds, each one attached to a leathery, papery wing that allows the seed to fly away to a certain distance when the right wind comes. Other trees choose a different strategy. They surround the seed by something that's good for eating, a fruit. This berry is what allows this seed to be unwillingly picked up by animals, especially birds, that like to eat the berry. They eat the flesh of the berry, but they cannot digest the seed that goes through their digestive system and is then expelled maybe several kilometers from here. Other trees still use different strategies, the most simple of which is gravity. Some fruits are so big because they have to contain all the nutrients that the seed needs to start up growing that they cannot travel very far. And all that they do is just falling down. This is the case of chestnut, for example, oak acorns, or even coconuts, one of the largest and heaviest seeds in the world. But the tree has therefore to make a choice. A choice between a lot of very small seeds, easily transported by the wind, but that do not contain a lot of nutrients. So leaving the small plants having to find immediately light and nutrients to grow up. Or investing in a very large seed that allows a successful initial survival of the small plant, but that cannot travel very far. This is one other example of the different strategies followed by evolution to allow reproduction in trees.